Hi, my name's Corinne Boone. I'm from Hatch. Just a comment, actually, because I think there's another driver here, and it's something I mentioned yesterday afternoon as well. And I think it was you, Gary, that mentioned that specifically in the coal power plant facilities that you have, it's not just the regulatory drivers, it's not just carbon reduction in general, it's technology innovation and technology turnover, because a lot of these plants have got to be replaced or have got to be upgraded, and I think that's a really interesting element that's going to play a large role in moving forward, because the time is right. It's not just about the climate change debate, and it's not just about incentives for CCS. It's also about taking the next steps to the new generation of technology, and I think that's very important, and probably something that could be an interesting part of the equation if we took a little bit more of a holistic look. And then another comment, Nick, you mentioned the role of public perception, and our company does a lot of work in the mining industry and CCS as well, and that is one of the biggest drivers for the success or failure of projects, and it's something I think that hasn't really been explored enough to date in CCS, and I'm glad that it's something that's coming up on the agenda now. Thanks.
Thank you.
Gary, can I just respond? There's one thing which I would like to say, actually, and it's around the technological issue. And it's not just new plants. Let's fully understand that this retrofit issue is a real critical one, because if you're going to engage the likes of China, for example, as I say, you're doing a gigawatt a week of coal power, that's all high-efficiency plant. You've got locked-in carbon there, and so you really need some effective, cost-effective retrofit solutions, particularly on the capture issue. And hopefully they will come through. So not only have we got to demonstrate, and anything that we demonstrate now, of course, outside, is existing technologies. It has to be. So there has to be a pipeline of technologies, and I couldn't agree more that you have to encourage the research and development just as much as doing these demonstrations. So it isn't just doing these demonstrations that will give you the confidence. You've got to have the technology coming through the pipe. You really have to. So it really is a thrust on that side too. And cost, as was said, is a critical issue. You know, capture, that's where the cost sits, well, most of the cost.
Dennis, you'd like to add to that?
Corinne, the point you bring up is very valid, because if you look at our fleet, we would not retrofit a unit that's not currently scrubbed because it would be cost prohibitive. So we're already then taking 6,000 megawatts offline that we wouldn't be doing in the future. So you have to look at that, and that the issue that some of these plants are 40 years old, and our investment has to be something for the future, because they're going to be there another 40 or 50 years, and that technology has to meet what's expected in 2050. So it's not a simple equation at all. I mean, we're looking at, well, do you take that 6,000 megawatts of old coal and convert to gas? Because people aren't using less energy. I mean, let's just make that clear. The energy use is growing throughout the world, and you can change light bulbs, you can do energy efficient appliances and households, and we need all that. But the fact is, when you replace a refrigerator in your house with an energy efficient one, the one that was there gets filled with beer and it's in the garage somewhere. So the public has to change their ways of doing things as well.
Thanks, Dennis. Another question from the floor?
Hi, Andy Kafuk from Task Engineering. 2 years ago when I was here, I asked a question of one of the, can't remember exactly what generator it was, but I said, what's a round figure for carbon capture, both in a gasification scenario where you've got it under high pressure and it's contained, and then another one for liberated combustion gases. And I got a number, basically says, in the neighborhood of $70 a ton, and $170 a ton for the contained, and $170 a ton for products of combustion. Now I know there's a huge gamut, and if it's an old machine, it's not worth it. And I realize there's no firm number, but can you give us some sort of a scale? Are we looking at 60 to 100 for gasification gases, and are we looking at 160 to 220 or something?
We're between, just for post-combustion, we're at around between $100 and $150 a ton captured. That doesn't count, though, the parasitic load that you're losing, which is another 20% on top of that. So our hope is to get it down under 100.
Is that operating cost as well?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Okay, good. That gives a feel. Anybody have knowledge about the gasification streams?
Yeah. This is a project that we've just completed. So, but I think it's fair to say that we're looking at the same sort of orders of magnitude of dollars per ton. In our particular case, though, we don't really concentrate on calculating the capture cost of CO2. What's really important is that once captured, where does it go? What revenue stream can you get? And then what's the ultimate generation cost of electricity that you're wanting to put into the grid? That's really the model that we look at. So, you know, we don't spend a lot of time trying to calculate, which is not an easy calculation, by the way, and there are different methodologies, and whichever you use, you get a different answer.
Accounting.
It's sort of, yeah, I don't want to abuse accountants too much, but it's, what I would say is, think of your end product. In our case, it's electricity. So what is the cost of that product going into the marketplace? That is, but I would say we're in a sort of similar order of magnitude.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We have time for one more question.
How convenient. I'm Catherine Holt. I'm a management consultant, and I do work with Spectra Energy on their current CCS project in BC. And this is a question for Nick. You mentioned in passing that CCS wasn't in the Kyoto Protocol. It also wasn't focused on or endorsed in particular at the Copenhagen discussions, to my knowledge. And when I look at the fact that there's no market, as we've talked about, and we're all relying on big government interest and investments in these projects, these big projects that you're counting on to build the credibility of the technology in the industry. In my experience, governments take their signals from events like the Copenhagen round, and if there's no explicit endorsement of the industry, governments tend to lose interest and look elsewhere, put their money in technologies that have higher public endorsement and credibility, which is what comes out of those discussions. So I'm just wondering if you could talk about the strategy to maybe get CCS onto that agenda, or your comments on why it isn't there at the moment.
Yeah, it's a really important issue. Let's say that to start with. It didn't get onto the agenda in Copenhagen. I think the issues were too big, really, before they get to that stage. But why it's not there is simply being blocked by a very small number of countries. Brazil is one, actually, that is not against CCS. It's against CCS in the CDM. That's the problem, because I think they feel that it will distort and affect their position vis-a-vis around that. So I would say it's anything. What happens post 2012 is to have CCS included in whatever the mechanisms are, and of course that wasn't clear in Copenhagen either. There was, in effect, 3 strands of continuation of current Kyoto mechanisms, something different. They're talking about different funds. There's actually, everybody says that Copenhagen didn't achieve, but there's some areas that it did do, and the addressing of this fast action fund, for example, to address the climate mitigation issues and adaptation issues in the developing world could well be used. And why can't CCS be part of that, for example? They're talking about building up to 100 billion a year, out in, I forget the dates, 2020, I think. Certainly, but it's going to be 30 billion by 2011, which is next year. So there's substantial funds being sort of set aside. Now, clearly, they've got to cover lots of different areas, but the continued use of fossil fuel in the developing countries is a real issue, let's say that. And I keep citing China, of course, but they may proportionally reduce, but the actual tonnage will go up. I mean, that's the truth of the matter when you look at what their scenarios are. So in order to engage them in the process, you've got to get CCS into the mechanisms, because otherwise they won't do it. I mean, they won't do it as fast as necessary anyway. So the strategy to get it in there, I mean, it's something that the Institute will try and help this year, because it's clearly, again, 2010 is another important year. Every year we say this is the vital year, but 2010, because of what happened in Copenhagen, what is going to come out of Mexico? You know, is something solid going to come out? And we will do our bit to try and encourage or ensure that the CCS is part of these mechanisms, because I think it's absolutely vital that it is. And many people agree with that, but it hasn't convinced everybody as yet, clearly.
Thank you, Nick. Dennis, you have one last comment before we wrap up?
Just that as far as the Copenhagen meetings, I think for many of us, you know, we thought it was a disappointment. But I can tell you that there were discussions in Copenhagen, side discussions and side meetings on carbon capture and storage. But it was kind of, you know, it's like all of us being at work for a week and working on a project, and then they say at the end of the week, your boss is going to come in and tell you what you're going to do. That's kind of what happened in Copenhagen. So everybody, you know, bit around the edges of the issues, waiting to see what's going to happen on the last 2 days. But I think that we will see someone lead in this area, and I'm hoping it's the United States, that within the next few weeks, the Kerry Graham-Lieberman bill will come out, and it's going to have significant incentives in it. Now, whether it gets passed is another thing, but it's the signal that will be given. There will be significant incentives in it for carbon capture and storage. And for that recognition that in the US, that coal and gas are all going to be a part of the solution along with everything else, I think, including offshore drilling and things like that, that if it wasn't for healthcare, we probably would have that legislation in the United States in 2010. But we're hoping that the government's not so tainted now that we'll get past that, because we need a clear signal. And I think the U.S. giving a clear signal that they're willing to commit, and industry is behind a lot of it because it's reasonable and achievable. So let's hope that happens too.
Thank you, panel. Thank you, Dennis. Thank you very much.